So you know that feeling when your skin is glowing and you know you look good, and it just brings out your inner confidence? There is nothing like it. Thankfully, Silver Mirror Facial Bar can help summon that feeling on command. They use the latest technologies, top-tier products, and seriously skilled estheticians to develop a custom plan just for you. Book your appointment today and get $30 off your first facial with the code CityCast30. Just go to silvermirror.com/CityCast and tell them we sent you by using code CityCast30.
DC cares about being green, but it feels like there is always something new to learn. How do I know what can and can't go in the recycling? And how do I collect compost without it stinking up my whole house? The list goes on. Thankfully, Paint Care makes responsibly recycling your leftover paint easy. Paint Care has 3 simple rules for painting smarter and reducing waste. 1, buy the right amount of paint for the job. 2, use up what's left. And 3, recycle the rest. To learn more or find a paint drop-off site near you, visit paintcare.org/3simplerules. That's paintcare.org/3 simple rules. Today on CityCast DC, for decades, DC's laws have been built to give tenants some muscle against landlords who might try to sell their buildings. But now that's changing. The DC Council is weighing some proposals to shrink what's called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. In the old days, the politics of this would have been pretty clear, but nowadays there's a twist, since some progressives have come to worry more about the supply of housing than the fate of individual tenants. Emilia Calma from the DC Policy Center has studied the issue, and she's here to explain. Today is Thursday, May 22nd. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC's talking about. Hey, Emilia.
Hey, Michael. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
All right, so we're talking about TOPA, which sounds very complicated, but I think a lot of people in DC, if they've been renters, they maybe know there's this thing where if your place is up for sale, maybe you can buy it in ways that other people can't. For folks who are unaware, what is TOPA? What do those letters stand for, and what's it supposed to do?
TOPA is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. We've had it for over 40 years. It was enacted in 1980 as part of the Rental Housing Conversion and Sale Act. And essentially, whenever a building is sold or recapitalized or like 50% of the interest is transferred, the tenants have some rights. So you can match the purchase price and buy the building as like condos or a co-op. That used to happen more regularly and is now pretty rare due to changes in the law and issues around tenant purchase. And much more commonly, tenants can assign their right to purchase to either the original buyer or a new buyer. And in that process, they can negotiate for things like building repairs, affordable housing deals, or even sometimes like financial payouts.
So this was created in the 80s, a time when, of the many concerns of Washington, incredibly high housing prices was not the same concern it is now. But the idea was to help tenants. How has it worked in practice?
Yeah, in the 80s, there were a lot of condo conversions and almost no new housing being produced. So people were worried that, as these buildings were being turned into condos, people would lose their housing and would have a harder time finding affordable housing. And so the original thought was they were going to prevent displacement by allowing tenants to just buy these units and live there. But we've changed the law a lot over time. And so while it used to be a vehicle for tenant purchase and about displacement, now almost all deals end in assignment of rights. It's like over 95% of deals.
And that means that people who want to build something or do something with a property feel like they're being gamed in a financial system.
Exactly. A lot of the developers feel like, these deals, which are often assigned to the original buyer, because in a market rate deal, you take the highest offer and tenants have a hard time finding like a matching offer to that. Like usually the highest bidder has already put in their offer of sale. And so a lot of people feel like these deals are being held up for these negotiations, some of which are seen as more legitimate than others. So the biggest controversy is around financial payouts. Some of these can be really high. Like we've heard tales of over $100,000. Anecdotally, a lot of my friends have gotten about $30,000 in a building sale. And some people, say like, that's a terrible outcome. Like we should be prioritizing other things like long-term affordability of the building. And some people say, well, there's one rich guy selling to another rich guy, and why shouldn't the tenants have a piece of that wealth transfer?
And so for the point of view of the developers or the real estate owners, one of the things this does is that, as you just said, it sort of extends how long it takes to get a deal done, which, since they are going to try to finance their deals, they're going to banks, that is going to make it more difficult or more expensive for them to get financing and either make the end result less profitable or more expensive for whoever buys in the end. But we've seen conflicting data around like how long does it usually extend a process? Is it, I've heard 18 months from the city. Other people have said 5. Is there like a rule of thumb on this?
Unfortunately, no. One of the big problems we have is that, well, A, we don't have a definition of success or metrics to evaluate that. So are we trying to achieve affordable housing, displacement, repairs to buildings? Like, we don't know. And some of these goals work against each other. And the other problem is that we have no data to evaluate whether or not the law is working. So we know when these transactions are happening, and we know when a tenant association forms. That's kind of the first step to either buying the building or assigning the purchase rights. But other than that, there's no source of data. So we don't really know how long these transactions are being delayed because of TOPA. We don't know what is being negotiated by the tenants. We don't know what kind of long-term affordability covenants are resulting from this. So I would say that, we've heard 420 days and we've heard over 5 months, but we don't have any concrete data on it. What we do know is that the delays do cause some problems for these deals. They can result in financial losses and kill deals altogether. Losses can happen because earnest money is tied up and, could be invested elsewhere. And it's just kind of being held in the bank for the length of time, which could be up to years if there's a legal challenge. And in this day and age, when there's all these interest rate fluctuations, the interest rate that you might start a deal at could totally change in 6 months, causing the entire thing to fall apart due to the negotiation time.
So on the other end of the ledger, it's not just developers, I don't think. But when my dad died, he had owned a house before my parents got married, and they never sold it. They always had tenants, a little house on B Street. And my mom decided, I'm not cut out for being a landlord. So she was going to sell it. And it was a nightmare. It was very, very difficult to get the tenant out. She wound up having to just pay a ton of money, even though the lease was expired, to have him go away. And it was I don't know about justice or non-justice, but it was an incredibly unpleasant experience for her. How common are stories like that?
Those stories are really common. And because of that, they actually exempted single-family housing from TOPA in 2018 because they found that people were reluctant to rent their housing units out because they were worried about situations like what you just described when they wanted to sell their house. But a lot of the same problems also exist for, these entire buildings. And these kind of delays, uncertainty, and the legal challenges can make DC a lot less attractive to investors. And a lot of these new buildings are owned like 90% by equity partners.
But what does equity partners mean for the uninitiated?
So you have a developer, and then you have basically people who financed your development. So people who put investors. Money into the housing unit, right? And they don't want to stay in this for the long term. Usually investors invest in one stage of housing. So they invest in new construction, or they invest, things like that. They want to rebalance their portfolios every 5 to 15 years so that they stay in that one narrow stage of the housing process. And the fear of delays and financial losses make DC investments less attractive, making it a lot harder to fund new buildings and, build new housing.
After the Fact, a podcast by Pew, keeps it real with data-driven insights on today's big issues. No spin, just facts, mixed with stories from experts, policymakers, and people making a difference. Whether you're into the research or the personal stories behind it, we've got you covered. So what are you waiting for? Listen to After the Fact wherever you get your podcasts.
If you're a CityCast superfan, you have definitely heard us singing the praises of our longtime supporter, Paulson & Nace. Big news! Paulson & Nace is now Nace Law Group. Same great team, just with a new name. When you are hurt by the negligence of others, you want a lawyer that will actually fight for you, not one that will settle for the bare minimum. Nace's compassionate lawyers fight to bring cases to juries so you can get everything you deserve. If you've been hurt or lost a loved one because of someone else's mistake or negligence, call Nace Law Group for a no-obligation consultation. Visit www.washingtondcinjurylawyers.com or call 202-463-1999. If you've never visited the Folger Shakespeare Theater, now is the time. It's showing the Shakespearean classic Twelfth Night, but with a groundbreaking modern twist that brings pure joy. This is not the Shakespeare that you fell asleep reading in 10th grade. It is a contemporary, sexy production of Shakespeare's great comedy. Sure, there's loss, love, and identity, but there's also a sense of discovery, lavish costumes, and great modern music. The director used the term elegant kink while describing it to me, so you already know you're in for a ride. Think She's the Man meets RuPaul's Drag Race. Performances start on May 13th and run through June 22nd, and tickets are going fast. Don't wait. Go to folger.edu/12th night to purchase tickets. That's folger.edu/2th night.
So this is a place where, I think you see some of the weird changes in our politics. That in the 80s, when this was first enacted, the concern, the progressive stance was, yes, this is great. We want to help vulnerable people who might be displaced, who are tenants. Now we're at a moment where a lot of progressives are particularly concerned about just how expensive it is and how little supply there is of housing, and see some of these old protections as actually helping incumbents and not really helping sort of large numbers of people. And I think about that because Councilmember Brianne Nadeau, who's thought of as one of the progressives on the council, has introduced a bill to reform TOPA. And Mayor Bowser also wants that. They're not usually on the same team. What is in her bill? What will it do? How will it change things for both landlords and tenants?
Yeah, as you said, there's two big bills on the table. First is the Rental Act from Mayor Bowser. It has a lot of provisions, but the ones related to TOPA exempt new construction for about 25 years and exempt affordable housing that has 20 years on a covenant. So this is pretty narrowly focused on incentivizing new housing. The Common Sense TOPA Reform Amendment Act, Nadeau's bill, is pretty distinct from the Rental Act. So where the Rental Act is really kind of narrowly focused on incentivizing new development and allowing these deals to pass for market rate properties, Nadeau's bill creates very minor tweaks to a lot of different parts of TOPA. It exempts new construction for only 3 years, and it makes all these tiny tweaks to allow certain people to be exempt from TOPA and creates certain new jobs for DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development. And importantly, I think it does a couple things. One, it actually does do some data collection. So we would have some information on TOPA outcomes, including, negotiated affordable housing and tenant associations and other really important facets of TOPA. And it would actually stop tenant associations from assigning their purchase rights to either the original buyer or a new buyer for 45 days. So it would require them to meet with a tenant support organization before they assign their purchase rights. A lot of these reforms are, as I said, really small, and I think a lot of people are going to find them too modest to fully address a lot of the issues we talked about. I will say that, we had recently released this big report on TOPA in March, and we found that 94% of the sales and all the transactions were happening in rent-controlled properties, so properties over 56 years old, over 50 years old. And 96% of places where tenant associations formed So that includes all of the assignment of rights, any purchase, etc.
Wait, when you say the transactions, you mean like this percentage of the incidents where tenants actually do exercise their right and purchase the place they live in?
No, I mean building sales, recapitalizations, and interest transfers.
How many of those wind up where the tenants wind up owning versus where the tenants are able to get some money as part of the process?
So over 10 years, we saw about 400 eligible transactions for TOPA, and we saw about 150 tenant associations form. And so the tenant association is where you would find that assignment of rights and that negotiation and potential purchase. As I said, we don't really have any outcome data, so we don't know what resulted from those tenant associations forming. But 96% of cases where a tenant association formed, it was in a rent-controlled property. So almost all the TOPA activity is not happening in this new construction. It's almost exclusively happening in these older, smaller buildings.
So Washington, is never used to be thought of as a very, very expensive city. It was a place where, there's the reason we had like a good punk rock scene here, because you could get a group house with your friends in like a pretty cool neighborhood. That's really not true anymore. And it has reoriented a lot of thinking about city policy. Is this an example of that?
The answer is that it might be making the city more expensive. What we're seeing right now is that this is discouraging investor interest in DC, which can dampen the amount of buildings that we're building. And the lack of supply certainly contributes to increased prices. And what we're seeing also is that with a lot of the negotiation, as I said, there's a lot of controversy around tenant payouts. And one of the things that comes up a lot is that affordable housing providers say that they'll make an offer to a building. It'll include long-term affordability, and the tenants choose a cash offer from a market rate developer over like a long-term affordable covenant on the building. Mm-hmm. So it's personally more beneficial to them, which I totally understand. Like I too would like a $30,000 check, if I could get one.
Is this a bigger problem in some parts of town than others?
A very high amount of rent-controlled properties are in wards 4 and 8. And Ward 4 in particular sees a lot of TOPA activity because the buildings tend to be smaller, and it's easier to, coalesce with your neighbors and create collective action in these buildings that are under 50 units. Where you see the least amount of tenant activity due to TOPA is in Ward 3. There are a lot of older properties there that are rent controlled, but the unit price is so high. It's much higher than in any of the other wards. And so you see the least amount of tenant activity there.
So there's been this running theme in critiques of Bowser's budget proposals, particularly this year, as the city grapples with this sort of generational crisis. The major employer of the city is sacking huge numbers of people, is talking about moving. The city is very worried about the economic impact of the Doge era. But one of the critiques has been that the mayor is either using this as an excuse or just using it to do giveaways to businesses, whether it's the Commander's Stadium or something else. The mayor's argument obviously would be, no, we're just trying to help the city diversify its economy in a time of emergency. On this issue, people who are against these changes to TOPA, is this a line of argument that they're making or likely to make?
The line of argument I've seen most commonly is that people who are pro-TOPA are worried about almost any changes happening to the law because they see it as a slippery slope. So, if you make some small concessions here, who knows what doors that will open up. But I think actually most people who work with the law, we interviewed a lot of people for our project across, all sides of the spectrum, affordable housing providers, affordable lenders, market rate developers, title agents, lawyers, and everyone agrees that there are some issues with the law and that it could be modernized to work better. And so I think that there is general agreement that something has to change. It's just an argument about what has to change.
So looking at the council or at the sort of broader debate in the city, who's against it, either specific people or sort of types of folks?
There's a lot of tenant advocates that I think are going to be very pro keeping TOPA exactly as it is. And if they do make any changes, just strengthening options to help tenant purchase and, get out any bad actors. And I think who's most pro reforms to TOPA include lenders, investors, and developers.
All right, so we are in May. What's the future of this debate? Is there a timeline?
Absolutely. There's a hearing on the 28th. It is open to the public, so anyone can testify. Right now, there's 85 people who are registered to testify.
Just for people who don't register a lot, is that a lot?
That's a fair amount. There are some hearings that have, over 100 people, and I assume that this will get there over the next week or so. But yeah, it's a lot of people. There's a huge amount of interest in this, and the hearing is not just about TOPA. It's on 4 different bills, but I think the main thread will be TOPA in the testimonies.
Is your sense that there's enough appetite on the council to pass it?
Well, there's several bills being proposed. So one is the Rental Act. One is, as you said, Nadeau's Common Sense TOPA Reform Amendment Act. And then there's also a bill about ERAP and changes to eviction filings, and one bill on fair housing practices.
Wait, what is ERAP?
The Eviction Reform Amendment Act.
I see.
It's a program we started in COVID that would allow people to apply for rent relief if they lost their jobs or had some other financial uncertainty. And it's had a lot of controversy over the last couple years as it's still been around, but it's often lacked the funding to actually help everybody who needs it. And it's actually changed our eviction procedures. So now evictions are taking about 2 years instead of 3 to 6 months. And it's changed a lot of the procedures that we do in the courts.
You going to be at the hearing?
I will testify, yes.
What do you expect? What do you expect the scene to be like?
I expect there to be a lot of strong feelings. Housing is one of those areas where a lot of people have very personal accounts, like you with your father's house, or, people who had their building sold and had either very positive or negative experiences, developers who have had a lot of wild things happen to them in the course of a sale. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of very strong opinions on all sides.
And it's a tough thing because, personal anecdotes are really stirring and visceral, but they're also probably not a great way to make public policy.
Absolutely. Yeah, the personal anecdotes are obviously really, really compelling. And I think what everyone's just trying to focus on, and what I've seen Robert White do a good job of doing, is trying to refocus everything on the best future for the city.
Hey, thanks, Emilia, for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show and you are one of the many, many people who's apparently going to go to this hearing, why don't you tell everyone there about it too? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.